2 Victoria Crosses, both earned in combat. Only soldier in history to do it. May 1941. Crete, a New Zealand soldier fights for 10 straight days against German paratroopers, kills at least 22 enemies, destroys a tank with grenades, gets wounded 3 times, refuses evacuation, keeps fighting until the battle ends, and earns the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Commonwealth. 1 year later, Egypt, the same soldier attacks German positions while wounded, leads his company with a bullet in his arm, gets captured, spends 3 years attempting escape 9 times from prisoner of war camps, gets sent to Colditz Castle because he won't stop trying to break out, and earns a second Victoria Cross, making him the only person ever to receive the decoration twice for combat actions. After the war, he goes back to farming, refuses interviews, declines book deals, avoids publicity, lives quietly for 50 years, and when people ask about his achievements, says he was just doing his job. This is Charles Upham, the most decorated combat soldier in Commonwealth history who didn't want anyone to know about it. Subscribe for impossible courage. Let's begin.
Charles Hazlitt Upham wasn't supposed to be a legend. He was supposed to be a farmer from Canterbury, New Zealand, living a quiet rural life, working the land, raising sheep, doing what generations of his family had done before him, maybe serving in the military if war came, but nothing exceptional, nothing that would make him famous, just competent service and return home to the farm. Born September 1st, 1908 in Christchurch, New Zealand, into a farming family, growing up in rural Canterbury, where life was simple and expectations were modest, and young men learned practical skills like animal husbandry and land management and self-reliance, because farms are isolated, and if something breaks, you fix it yourself, because help isn't coming. He goes to school, does well academically, shows particular aptitude for practical problem solving, the kind of intelligence that isn't about memorizing facts, but about figuring out how things work and how to make them work better. And after finishing school, he enrolls at Canterbury Agricultural College, because farming is what he knows and what his family does, and in 1930s New Zealand, there aren't infinite career options for rural kids. Graduates with a diploma in agriculture and farm management, goes to work as a farm manager and shepherd in the Canterbury High Country, hard physical work in difficult terrain, long hours outdoors in all weather, the kind of work that builds physical toughness and mental resilience, because when you're alone with sheep in the mountains for weeks at a time, you learn to handle problems independently. 1939, September 1st, Germany invades Poland. World War II begins, and New Zealand, as part of the British Commonwealth, commits to sending troops, and Charles Upham, at age 30, decides to enlist not because he's militaristic or seeking adventure, but because it's what New Zealand men do when the Empire calls. You serve, you do your duty, you come home. He joins the New Zealand military forces, goes through officer training because he has education and leadership qualities, gets commissioned as a second lieutenant assigned to the 20th Battalion, 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and shipped out to Egypt in early 1940 to join British and Commonwealth forces preparing to fight Germans and Italians in North Africa and the Mediterranean.
The 20th Battalion spends months training in Egypt, desert warfare exercises, learning to operate in heat and sand and with limited water, and Charles proves to be a natural soldier, not the parade ground type who looks good in uniform, but the practical type who solves problems and leads by example and earns respect from men who can tell the difference between officers who give orders and officers who know what they're doing. His platoon performs well in exercises. His superiors note that he has initiative and judgment and the ability to stay calm under pressure, qualities that matter more in combat than textbook knowledge of military doctrine. April 1941, Germany invades Greece and Yugoslavia. Commonwealth forces, including New Zealand troops, deploy to Greece to help defend against the German advance, and the 20th Battalion gets sent north from Egypt, and Charles gets his first taste of combat. rearguard actions as Allied forces retreat through Greece against superior German forces with air superiority and armor advantage, fighting that's chaotic and desperate, and where junior officers like Charles have to make instant decisions because circumstances change faster than orders can come down from headquarters. The Greece campaign is a disaster strategically. Commonwealth forces are evacuated after 3 weeks of fighting, but Charles performs well, keeps his men together under pressure, demonstrates that he can function effectively when everything's going wrong. Late April 1941, Allied forces evacuate Greece. Most go back to Egypt, but some, including the 20th Battalion, get sent to Crete, a Greek island in the Mediterranean that's strategically important because it controls sea lanes and could be used as a base for air operations. And British command decides to hold Crete against expected German attack. The 20th Battalion arrives exhausted from the Greece campaign, understrength, low on equipment and ammunition, and takes up defensive positions in the Alamein area on the western part of the island. And everyone knows the Germans are coming, but nobody knows exactly when or how. May 20th, 1941, 0700 hours. German invasion of Crete begins with massive airborne assault, thousands of paratroopers dropping from transport aircraft, gliders landing with troops and equipment. The largest airborne operation in history to that point, and the plan is to capture Crete's 3 airfields so German forces can fly in reinforcements and supplies. And one of those airfields is Alamein, where Charles Upham and the 20th Battalion are positioned. The initial drop is chaos, paratroopers scattered across the landscape, many landing in kill zones where Commonwealth troops are waiting, heavy casualties on both sides, but Germans keep coming. More waves of aircraft dropping more paratroopers, and what's supposed to be a defensive battle becomes 10 days of continuous combat, where Charles Upham fights essentially non-stop from May 20th to May 30th and earns his first Victoria Cross through sustained, extraordinary action. The problem with describing Charles Upham's actions on Crete is that they span 10 days of confused close-quarter fighting, where he's constantly moving, attacking German positions, leading counterattacks, rescuing wounded soldiers, destroying enemy positions, and getting wounded multiple times but refusing evacuation. So there's no single dramatic moment. It's 10 days of aggressive combat, where he repeatedly does things that individually would be noteworthy, but collectively are almost incomprehensible. His Victoria Cross citation is one of the longest ever written because it has to describe 10 days of actions, and even that's incomplete because witnesses kept reporting things he did that weren't in the original reports. May 20th, the first day, German paratroopers land near the 20th Battalion's positions. Charles leads his platoon in counterattack, kills multiple Germans, captures a machine gun position, gets wounded by shrapnel, refuses medical evacuation, continues fighting. May 21st, German forces are consolidating around Alamein airfield. Charles leads another attack on German positions, destroys a machine gun nest with grenades, kills the crew, gets wounded again, still refuses evacuation. His commanding officer orders him to get treatment. Charles gets bandaged and returns to his platoon within hours. May 22nd through 24th, the fighting intensifies as Germans reinforce through Alamein airfield, which they've captured despite heavy resistance. New Zealand and British forces are conducting fighting withdrawal to new defensive positions, and Charles is constantly in action, leading attacks on German positions to buy time for withdrawal, rescuing wounded men under fire. At one point, he carries a wounded soldier over his shoulder while under machine gun fire for several hundred yards to safety, gets wounded a third time by mortar fragments, refuses evacuation again, and his company commander is getting frustrated because Charles keeps fighting wounded and won't follow orders to seek medical treatment. May 25th. Charles and his platoon are holding a position when German forces attack with tank support, and Charles decides that the tank needs to be destroyed, so he grabs grenades and runs toward the tank while under fire from German infantry, gets close enough to throw grenades at the tank, disables it, kills the crew as they try to escape, then attacks the supporting German infantry, kills several, forces the rest to withdraw, and returns to his position like this is normal behavior. His men are simultaneously impressed and concerned because their platoon commander seems to have no sense of self-preservation. May 26th through 28th, New Zealand forces are conducting final withdrawal from Crete. rear guard actions to allow evacuation of troops from southern ports, and Charles volunteers for every dangerous assignment, leads attacks to cover the withdrawal. At one point, he single-handedly attacks a German position that's threatening the withdrawal route, kills the defenders, holds the position long enough for his company to pass, then withdraws under fire. He's wounded multiple times by this point, has shrapnel in various parts of his body, infected wounds, hasn't slept properly in 8 days, and he's still functioning at full combat effectiveness.
May 29th and 30th. Final evacuation from Crete. Charles and his company are among the last to leave, fighting rear guard actions until the last possible moment, and Charles is one of the last men to board the evacuation ship, wounded, exhausted, covered in blood and dirt. And when they get to Egypt, his superiors finally force him to accept medical treatment for his wounds, and he spends weeks in hospital recovering from shrapnel wounds, infections, and exhaustion. His commanding officers write up his actions for decoration. The Victoria Cross citation describes 10 days of extraordinary courage and leadership, multiple attacks on enemy positions, numerous occasions where he risked his life to save others, continued fighting despite multiple wounds, and the citation notes that he performed these actions while repeatedly refusing medical evacuation and orders to seek treatment. December 1941, Charles receives the Victoria Cross from the king at a ceremony in Cairo, and he's uncomfortable with the attention, doesn't like being singled out for doing what he considers his job, tells people that his men deserved credit, not him, and as soon as the ceremony is over, he wants to return to his battalion and get back to being a regular officer. The Victoria Cross makes him famous in New Zealand. Newspapers run stories about the Kiwi hero of Crete, and Charles hates it, avoids interviews, doesn't talk about his actions, wants to be left alone to do his job. Mid-1942, Charles is now a captain, back with the 20th Battalion, which has been reinforced and re-equipped, and they're preparing for a major offensive in Egypt, the First Battle of El Alamein, where Commonwealth forces are trying to stop German and Italian advance toward the Suez Canal. The 20th Battalion is assigned to attack German positions at Ruwaisat Ridge on July 15, 1942, and Charles commands a company in the assault, and what's supposed to be a coordinated attack with armor support becomes a disaster when the tanks don't arrive on schedule, and the infantry attacks anyway and runs into heavy German defenses. July 15th, 0400 hours, the attack begins. Charles leads his company forward across open ground toward German positions. They're taking casualties from machine gun fire and artillery. The attack is faltering, other companies are pinned down or withdrawing, and Charles decides that the only way forward is to attack the German positions aggressively and break through their defenses. He's wounded early in the attack, bullet through his arm, and he ignores it, keeps leading his men forward. They reach the first German position, and Charles personally leads the assault, throwing grenades, shooting Germans, clearing trenches, and captures the position despite being wounded. The attack continues, Charles leading despite his wound. They take more German positions, capture prisoners, but casualties are mounting, and the situation is confused because the planned armor support never arrived, and they're isolated from other Commonwealth units, surrounded by German forces. And Charles realizes they're in a bad position, but decides to hold what they've captured rather than withdraw. His arm is bleeding badly. Medics try to treat him. He refuses to stop fighting, continues commanding his company, organizing defense of their captured positions, preparing for inevitable German counterattack. German counterattack comes later that morning, infantry and armor, and Charles's company is heavily outnumbered. They're fighting from captured German trenches, ammunition running low, wounded mounting, and Charles is everywhere, moving between positions, directing fire, encouraging his men, and then he's hit again, this time more seriously, and he finally collapses from blood loss and shock. His men get him to a field aid station, medics stabilize him, but German forces overrun the position, and Charles, along with many of his men, are captured. The rest of the war for Charles Upham is spent as a prisoner of war.
And if you think that means his fighting days are over, you don't understand Charles Upham. He spends 3 years in German POW camps attempting to escape. 9 documented escape attempts, constant disruption, refusing to cooperate with German camp administration, making life difficult for guards, organizing other prisoners, and becoming such a persistent problem that the Germans eventually sent him to Colditz Castle, the special high-security camp for Allied prisoners who won't stop escaping, where he spends the last years of the war with other incorrigibles like Douglas Bader. His first escape attempt is from the initial POW camp in Italy, before he's even fully recovered from his wounds. Tries to walk out disguised as an Italian worker, gets caught at the gate, spends time in solitary confinement. Second attempt, tries to tunnel out. Tunnel is discovered, more solitary. Third attempt, tries to cut through wire fence, caught by guards, solitary again. The pattern continues. Every few months, Charles attempts another escape, sometimes solo, sometimes with other prisoners, and German guards come to recognize him as the New Zealander who won't stop trying. 1943, Charles is transferred to German camps, first to a camp in Poland, then to various camps in Germany as Allied forces advance and Germans move prisoners away from front lines. And at every camp, Charles attempts escape, studies guard routines, scouts escape routes, recruits other prisoners, and makes multiple attempts, all unsuccessful, but each one costing the Germans time and resources to prevent and investigate. His fellow prisoners admire his determination, but also worry that he's going to get himself killed because the Germans are getting increasingly frustrated with him. Late 1944, Charles and several other persistent escapers are transferred to Colditz Castle, off Flag 4C, the special camp for prisoners who won't stop escaping, a medieval castle on a cliff that the Germans believe is escape-proof. And when Charles arrives, he meets other Allied officers who've been similarly troublesome, including some British officers he heard about from his Crete days. Colditz is supposed to be inescapable, but prisoners are constantly attempting it, and Charles immediately starts planning his own escape attempts, even though he knows the odds are terrible. At Colditz, Charles continues his pattern, studies the castle's defenses, looks for weaknesses, works on escape plans with other prisoners, makes several attempts, all unsuccessful because Colditz really is extremely secure and Germans have guards everywhere and experience dealing with escape attempts. But Charles won't stop. It's become a matter of principle for him. He's a prisoner of war, and attempting escape is his duty, and the fact that it's nearly impossible just means he has to be more creative. April 1945. American forces are approaching Colditz. The war is clearly ending. German guards are getting nervous, and prisoners know liberation is coming soon. But Charles is still planning escape attempts, because until you're actually liberated, you're still a prisoner. Finally, on April 16, 1945, American troops capture Colditz Castle. Prisoners are freed, and Charles Upham, after 3 years as POW, is finally going home to New Zealand. While Charles was in captivity, the British government awarded him a second Victoria Cross for his actions at El Alamein in July 1942. The citation describing how he led his company despite being wounded, captured multiple German positions, continued fighting until he collapsed from wounds, and displayed exceptional courage and leadership under fire. The award is announced in September 1945 after the war ends, and when Charles learns about it, he's reportedly unhappy, doesn't think his actions deserved a second Victoria Cross, believes other officers did similar things, and the attention makes him uncomfortable because he never wanted to be famous. Charles Upham becomes the only person ever to receive the Victoria Cross twice for combat actions. 3 other people have received it twice, but their second awards were for non-combat activities, making Charles unique in military history, and this makes him even more famous, which he hates even more. When he returns to New Zealand in late 1945, he's a national hero. Crowds at the dock, newspaper coverage, government officials wanting to honor him, and Charles wants none of it. He just wants to go back to farming and be left alone. Post-war, Charles buys a farm in North Canterbury, marries, has children, lives quietly as a farmer, and refuses all requests for interviews, declines book deals, avoids publicity, doesn't attend military reunions, doesn't want to talk about the war, and gets annoyed when journalists show up trying to write stories about him.
He maintains that he was just doing his duty, that many men did similar things, that his men deserved credit, not him, and that being singled out for decoration was uncomfortable and undeserved. His children grow up not knowing much about their father's war service because he doesn't talk about it, and when they ask, he changes the subject or gives minimal answers.
1956. Charles receives another honor, the Order of New Zealand, but he's reluctant to accept it, and only does so after being persuaded that refusing would be insulting to the government. He attends the ceremony, collects the award, and returns to farming as quickly as possible, relieved to be away from public attention. Over the following decades, journalists occasionally approach him. Military historians want to write about him, documentary filmmakers want to interview him, and he refuses them all, maintaining his privacy and living quietly as a farmer. 1994. Charles Upham dies at age 85 on his farm in Canterbury, having lived 50 years of peaceful obscurity after his extraordinary wartime service, and his obituaries in newspapers around the world note that he was probably the most decorated combat soldier in Commonwealth history, and definitely the most reluctant hero, someone who did extraordinary things and spent the rest of his life trying to avoid recognition for them. His funeral is attended by military officials and veterans, but per his wishes there's no state funeral and no excessive ceremony, just a quiet service for a farmer who happened to earn 2 Victoria Crosses. The question of what made Charles Upham extraordinary is interesting because his personality doesn't fit typical hero narratives. He wasn't aggressive or seeking glory. He was a quiet, practical farmer who joined the military out of duty. But in combat, he displayed sustained courage and aggressive leadership that exceeded what most soldiers are capable of. His actions on Crete weren't single moments of heroism, but 10 days of continuous combat, where he repeatedly attacked enemy positions, rescued wounded men, and refused to stop fighting despite multiple wounds, demonstrating endurance and determination that's rare even among decorated soldiers. His second Victoria Cross at El Alamein is notable because he was wounded early in the attack and continued leading his company for hours while bleeding, refusing medical treatment until he literally collapsed, the kind of dedication to mission and men that defines great combat leadership. And then his 3 years as POW, attempting escape 9 times, shows that his determination wasn't limited to combat. He simply refused to accept situations he disagreed with, whether that was being told to evacuate when wounded or being told to accept imprisonment. The comparison to other double Victoria Cross recipients is instructive. There are only 4 people who've received the award twice, and 3 of them received their second award for non-combat actions, like medical service or bomb disposal, making Charles the only person to receive both for direct combat action against enemy forces. This puts him in a category by himself, the only soldier in history of the Victoria Cross to earn it twice through fighting. And that uniqueness is part of why he's remembered despite his desire for obscurity. The significance of his actions extends beyond personal achievement because his performance on Crete and at El Alamein influenced tactical outcomes. On Crete, his constant aggressive action against German positions disrupted their operations and bought time for Allied withdrawal. At El Alamein, his company's capture of German positions despite heavy casualties contributed to the broader battle's success. His 9 escape attempts as POW cost Germans resources and forced them to divert guards and attention to managing difficult prisoners, contributing in small ways to Allied victory by making German operations more complicated. The psychological aspect of Charles Upham's story is worth examining because his personality was unusual for a highly decorated soldier. Most recipients of the Victoria Cross are comfortable with recognition, or at least accept it gracefully. Charles actively avoided it and was uncomfortable with fame, suggesting that his motivation in combat wasn't glory or recognition, but duty and practical problem-solving. He saw situations that needed fixing, like German positions that needed destroying, or wounded men who needed rescuing, and he fixed them. And the fact that this involved enormous personal risk was incidental to solving the problem. His post-war life demonstrates remarkable consistency.
He didn't trade on his fame, didn't use his decorations to launch political career or business ventures, just returned to farming and lived the life he would have lived if the war never happened, showing that his military service was interruption of his preferred life, not definition of it. This kind of humility is rare among highly decorated soldiers. Most embrace their status, at least to some degree. Charles rejected it entirely and successfully maintained privacy for 50 years, despite being famous. The legacy of Charles Upham within New Zealand is that he represents a particular Kiwi ideal, the unassuming, practical person who does extraordinary things when circumstances require, but doesn't seek recognition, just does the job and gets back to normal life. And this resonates with New Zealand's self-image as nation of practical, unpretentious people who don't put on airs. He's remembered not just for his Victoria Crosses, but for refusing to be defined by them, maintaining his identity as farmer despite fame. The military lessons from Charles Upham's career are about sustained performance under pressure. Most combat heroism involves brief, intense action. Charles demonstrated that he could maintain extraordinary performance level for extended days, 10 days on Crete, hours at El Alamein while wounded, 3 years of escape attempts as POW, showing psychological resilience and physical endurance that enabled consistent high performance regardless of circumstances. His leadership style was lead by example rather than orders from behind. He didn't ask men to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and his willingness to take same risks he asked of others earned respect and motivated men to follow him. The comparison to other soldiers in this series is interesting. Douglas Bader overcame no legs to fly fighters. Lakhiman Gurung fought with one hand. Leo Major liberated a city with one eye. And Charles Upham didn't overcome physical disability, but overcame something else. The tendency of most people to accept limitations, whether physical or circumstantial. He simply refused to accept that wounds should stop him, or that imprisonment should be accepted, or that fame was deserved. And that refusal to accept external limitations defined his entire military career. If you know someone who's being told to accept limitations they don't agree with, whether those limitations are physical or social or institutional, someone who sees problems that need solving and everyone says it's not their job or not possible or too risky, share this story, not because everyone should be Charles Upham, but because sometimes we need reminders that refusing to accept limitations enables achievement that seems impossible, that sustained effort over time accomplishes more than brief dramatic action, and that you can do extraordinary things and still maintain humility and ordinary life afterward. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of warriors who redefined possible through determination, battles where individual courage changed outcomes, and soldiers who demonstrated that heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about solving problems regardless of personal risk. Hit that notification bell, because we're bringing you more proof that human capability under pressure exceeds organizational assumptions. More examples of sustained excellence under impossible circumstances, and more warriors who showed that the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is often just the decision to keep going when others would stop. And remember, when you face your own impossible situation, your own moment when circumstances say accept limitations, but your judgment says keep pushing, you have the same choice Charles Upham had. You can accept what you're told is possible, or you can decide that limitations are suggestions and see what happens when you refuse to stop. Charles Upham earned 2 Victoria Crosses and spent 50 years avoiding recognition because he was just solving problems and didn't think that deserved fame. That humility combined with extraordinary achievement made him legend. What will you accomplish when you stop accepting other people's definitions of possible?